There's a recording that circulates through every corner of the known galaxy now. Most species have seen it. The Velhari play it during their military academies as a cautionary exhibit. The Dranathi Collective broadcast it annually, the way humans once played war footage on Memorial Days, not to glorify, but to remember. The Sorvani, who don't even have a word for soldier in their native tongue, have watched it 300 million times across their homeworld's networks. It's 11 minutes and 42 seconds long. It was filmed by a Kasari diplomatic observer named Yethoru, who was stationed aboard the neutral platform Avelian's Rest during what should have been a routine territorial arbitration. The footage is shaky in places. The audio cuts out twice. There are moments where Yethoru's own breathing is the loudest thing you can hear, and that breathing tells you everything you need to know about what he was witnessing. I've watched it probably 60 times. I was there for some of it, not for the 11 minutes, for the hours before that, for the build-up that nobody filmed, that most of the galaxy doesn't know about because the cameras weren't rolling yet, and because frankly nobody thought anything important was going to happen that day. I'm going to tell you what actually happened. All of it. My name is Corin Vasht. I'm a logistics coordinator for the Interstellar Commerce Mediation Bureau, the ICMB. If you want the acronym, though most people in the galaxy just call us the Gray People, because our uniforms are gray and because our job is, by design, as boring as physically possible. We move goods, settle disputes about tariffs, negotiate transit rights through contested corridors. We are the human embodiment of a filing cabinet. Nobody looks at us. Nobody worries about us. We are institutional wallpaper. That's not me being self-deprecating. That's the job description, more or less. I was assigned to Avelian's Rest for a 6-month posting that was supposed to consist entirely of reviewing cargo manifests and attending 3 scheduled arbitration sessions involving mineral extraction rights in the Pelhari Drift. The kind of assignment you get when you've been doing this long enough that the Bureau trusts you to not make things worse, but not long enough that they'd trust you to make things significantly better. I was 34 years old. I'd been with the ICMB for 9 years. I had a small cabin on the station's residential tier, a collection of approximately 800 hours of downloaded entertainment that I never had enough time to watch, and a standing dinner arrangement with 2 colleagues, a Velhari woman named Sarah Thulo, and a human from New Brisbane named Marcus Ford, every Tuesday and Thursday evening. That was my life on Avelian's Rest. It was fine, it was genuinely fine. The station itself was something to behold, I'll say that. Avelian's Rest was old, older than formal interstellar governance, older than the Galactic Accord, older even than the first official contact protocols. It had been a refueling depot, a pirate haven, a refugee processing center, a cultural exchange hub, and about 14 other things over its centuries of existence before the Accord finally purchased it and converted it into a permanent neutral platform. The kind of place that had so much history embedded in its walls that you could feel it sometimes, late at night, when the recycled air had that particular metallic tinge, and the distant hum of the station's aging reactor was the only sound. The architecture was layered, literally and figuratively. The oldest sections of the station were built in the Keth style, low ceilings, curved walls, everything rounded because the Keth believed that sharp angles accumulated spiritual debt. Newer sections had been added in waves by whoever controlled the station at the time, so you'd turn a corner and go from Keth curves to the sharp geometric brutalism of Dranathi construction to the living wall design of Velhari bioengineering. It was a mess. It was also beautiful in the way that only genuinely old, genuinely lived-in places can be. The central hub, the part they called the Commons, was 5 stories tall with a dome of transparent composite at the top that looked out into open space. Different species had different reactions to that dome. Some found it peaceful. Some found it existentially terrifying. Most humans, myself included, found it both, simultaneously, which I think says something about us that is either very deep or very trivial, depending on your mood. There were roughly 6,000 beings on the station at any given time. Maybe a third of them were permanent or semi-permanent residents like me. The rest were passing through, traders, diplomats, tourists, wanderers, researchers, people who were between somewhere and somewhere else. The species mix shifted constantly. Some weeks the station felt predominantly Kasari, all clicks and bioluminescent displays in the corridors. Other weeks it was thick with Velhari, their feathered crests catching the artificial light, their low harmonic greetings vibrating the walls. Humans were maybe 8% of the population on any given day, enough to be noticeable, not enough to feel like a majority anywhere. The Galactic Accord had been in place for 67 years by the time of the incident. It had been negotiated over a period of about 30 years before that, the most complicated diplomatic process in recorded history, involving 41 species, approximately 900 individual territorial disputes, 4 near wars, 2 actual wars, and so many compromises that the final document ran to 11 million pages in its shortest version. Humans had been a late addition. We'd made first contact with the Velhari about 90 years prior, and then through the Velhari we'd been introduced to the broader galaxy, and the broader galaxy had been cautiously interested. Most species had passed through a period of major conflict before achieving interstellar travel. It seemed to be something of a universal pattern. You develop the technology to leave your home system. You do so partly because you're running out of room. You encounter someone else who's also running out of room, and violence follows. Most species had worked through it. The Velhari called this phase the terrible adolescence. Almost everyone had won. Humans had a particularly bad one. The history was long and complicated, and I'm not going to rehearse all of it here, because it's not really the point. The short version is that in the roughly 40 years between first contact and the signing of the Accord, humanity had been involved in 3 separate interstellar conflicts, had nearly triggered 2 more, and had developed a reputation throughout the galaxy that ranged from concerning to, frankly, terrifying, depending on which species you asked. The Accord, when humanity finally joined it, included a provision called the Human Military Restriction Clause. It was negotiated specifically for us. It stated, in formal Accord language, that human military forces were prohibited from operating in any capacity beyond a 300 light-year radius of Earth's solar system, except under very specific circumstances approved by a supermajority of the Accord Council. The clause wasn't punitive exactly. That's what the Accord diplomats said when it was announced, and I believe most of them believed it. It was framed as a stabilization measure. Humanity would be allowed to maintain internal security forces. We could participate in Accord peacekeeping operations at the non-combat level, logistics, medical observation. We could carry personal sidearms for self-defense in the same way any individual of any species could, but no military units. No warships beyond personal defense vessels. No weapons of mass deployment anywhere beyond our home radius. Humans, for the most part, accepted it. Some didn't. There were protests, there were political movements, there were people who called it a humiliation. But the majority accepted it, partly because the alternative was exclusion from the Accord entirely, and partly because a lot of humans, looking honestly at the history, understood why the galaxy was nervous. So for 67 years, that clause stood. Humans were in the Accord. Humans were participating in interstellar civilization. We were doing well, actually. Turns out that all that energy that used to go into military development went into trade and exploration and medicine and engineering, and we were pretty good at those things. The galaxy mostly forgot to be afraid of us. That's the context. That's what everyone needs to understand before I tell you what happened on Avelian's Rest. The arbitration session was scheduled for 1400 station time on what I was calling a Thursday, because I'd never fully let go of Earth timekeeping, even after 9 years off-planet. It was a Tier 2 session, medium stakes, nothing that was going to make galactic history. The dispute was between the Sorvani Collective and a Drenathi mining corporation called Hexathane Industries over transit rights through a corridor in the Pelhari Drift. The Sorvani wanted protected lanes for their research vessels. Hexathane wanted to run heavy extraction ships through the same corridor at a frequency that the Sorvani said would make their research impossible. Classic territorial tension. The kind of thing the ICMB handled 3 or 4 times a month. What made this particular session slightly more complicated than usual was that the Drenathi had sent a security delegation alongside their corporate representatives. This wasn't technically prohibited. Under Accord rules, any party to an arbitration could bring security personnel within limits. The limits were specific. No more than 12 armed individuals, weapons had to be registered with the station's security office before arrival, and all security personnel had to wear visible identification. The Drenathi delegation had 12 security officers, all properly registered, all properly identified, all carrying the kind of weapons that fell within Accord parameters, sidearms, essentially. though Drenathi sidearms were a bit more substantial than most species equivalents. The Sorvani delegation had no security personnel. The Sorvani didn't do security personnel. They were a consensus-based species that had resolved internal conflict through collective mediation for about 3,000 years, and the concept of armed guards struck them as roughly as sensible as carrying a saw to negotiate a handshake. I noticed the imbalance when the delegations arrived. Sarah Thulo noticed it too. She mentioned it to me over comm that morning, said it felt like Hexathane was trying to make a point before the session even started. I agreed. I flagged it in an internal memo to the station's chief mediator, a Kasari named Orvith Palin who had been doing this job for 40 years and had seen everything. She wrote back 2 words, "Noted, proceed." So I proceeded. The session opened in Mediation Suite 3, which was on the station's 4th level. Mediation Suite 3 could hold about 40 beings comfortably. It had a curved table designed to eliminate the concept of head of the table, very intentional, very accord, and chairs adapted for 12 different body types. The walls were a neutral gray-white that the designers had picked specifically because no species found it either calming or agitating. The lighting was tuned to be tolerable for eyes ranging from ultraviolet sensitive to infrared dependent. The Sorvani delegation was 3 beings. Their lead representative was a linguist diplomat named Venserath, older, moved slowly, spoke in the low vibrations that translated through the room's universal interpretation system as something like a warm baritone. The other 2 Sorvani were academic specialists who were there to provide technical information about the research programs the corridor transit would disrupt. The Drenathi delegation was 6 beings. Their lead was a corporate negotiator named Drexhaven, humanoid enough in shape that I always slightly miscalibrated my initial read of him, because the surface similarities masked how differently Drenathi actually thought about situations like this. He was polished, articulate, and had the kind of prepared friendliness that made you feel the friendliness was a tool. The 12 Drenathi security officers were stationed outside the suite, 4 directly at the doors, 8 in the corridor. My role in the session was to manage the documentation, recording, translating into the Accord's standard archival format, flagging any procedural issues for Orvith Palin. I sat at a small secondary desk to the right of the main table, essentially invisible, the way ICMB logistics coordinators were supposed to be. The session started at 14:03. By 15:47, it was clear that things were not going well. I don't mean there was shouting. There wasn't. Drenathi don't shout. They go quieter when they're angry, not louder, their voices dropping to a register that most species find unsettling because it's below comfortable hearing range. And the Sorvani communication style didn't accommodate shouting as a concept. They didn't have the biology for it. But the tension was real. Having had moved the conversation away from the specific transit rights question and toward a broader argument about Sorvani exclusivity claims in the Drift region, a framing the Sorvani had not agreed to, and that, if accepted, would effectively gut their position. Venserath was holding his ground, but there was a quality to his vibrations that the interpretation system was translating as something between distress and controlled outrage. And I'd been in enough of these sessions to know that translation was probably accurate. Orvith Palin kept trying to redirect the conversation back to the specific agenda items. Having kept agreeing to redirect, and then redirecting right back to the framing he preferred. It was a technique I recognized, the kind of negotiating maneuver that says, "I'm not here to reach an agreement, I'm here to establish a record." Around 1600, having requested a 30-minute recess. Orvith Palin granted it. The Sorvani delegation moved toward the small adjacent rest room. The Drenathi delegation stepped out into the corridor. I flagged another note to Orvith Palin. Session dynamics suggests Drenathi may not be negotiating in good faith. Recommend considering formal procedure request for next phase. She replied, agreed, drafting now. I sat back and stretched. My back was stiff. I'd been sitting at that desk for almost 2 hours. I thought about coffee, real coffee, not the synthesized version, which the station's commissary had started stocking after a survey found that humans represented a larger percentage of the population than initially accounted for, and that our single most consistent request was for actual coffee beans. I was thinking about that coffee when my comm unit buzzed. The message was from Marcus Ford, who was also at the session as a secondary documentation observer. He was newer to the bureau than me, still doing his first major posting. It said something's happening outside, in the main corridor, not sure you can see from where you're sitting. I looked up. Through the glass panel set into the mediation suite's door, I could see a portion of the corridor. The Drenathi security officers were no longer stationed where they'd been. I stood up, moved carefully to the door, and looked out. The corridor outside Mediation Suite 3 ran about 40 meters before it intersected with one of Avelian's Rest's main transit arteries, a wide, high-ceilinged passage that connected the station's diplomatic level with the residential and commercial tiers. The transit artery was always busy. At 1600, it was very busy, end of the work cycle for most of the station's permanent staff, commuters moving between levels, traders heading toward the commercial district. The Drenathi security officers had moved to the intersection point. All 12 of them. They were standing in a formation that was, technically, just standing. Nobody had drawn a weapon. Nobody was blocking anyone from passing. They were within their rights under Accord security provisions. But they were standing in a way that made the intersection feel narrower. That made the corridor feel watched. That made people slow down as they approached, take in the 12 armed Drenathi in their corporate security colors, and choose to go a different way if they could. What they were doing, without explicitly doing anything, was making the Sorvani delegation's path back to their quarters feel like it went through a corridor of armed Drenathi security. It was subtle. It was the kind of thing you couldn't easily file a formal complaint about, but it was a message. The Drenathi were reminding the Sorvani, and everyone else who was paying attention, that hexathane had brought muscle to this arbitration, and the Sorvani hadn't, and that this was a relevant fact. I watched it for about 30 seconds, doing the calculation that every ICMB employee learns to do. Is this a situation where intervention makes it better or makes it worse? Is there something procedurally I can trigger here, or would that just escalate? Is this my call? Then I saw who else was watching. There were 3 humans in that corridor. Not ICMB, not diplomatic. They were travelers, the kind of people who moved through Avelian's Rest for reasons that had nothing to do with the arbitration, who just happened to be there because the station was where they were. I recognized one of them. Her name was Jonna Reyes. She was a cargo hauler who'd been in and out of the station 3 times during my posting, running independent freight between 4 systems in the Drift region. She was maybe 50, brown-skinned, gray-streaked hair pulled back, wearing the kind of practical clothes that said she spent most of her life moving between ships and loading docks. I'd spoken to her twice, once about a transit documentation issue, once just in the commissary line. She was sharp and practical, and had the particular quality that long-haul freight operators tended to develop, which was a very complete awareness of physical space and what was happening in it. She was watching the Drenathi security formation with the same expression I was probably wearing. The other 2 humans were younger, a man and a woman, maybe late 20s, with the kind of equipment bags that said researchers or surveyors. I didn't know them. The 3 of them were standing at the edge of the transit artery intersection, taking in what was happening. And then Jonna Reyes did something. She didn't do it dramatically. She didn't announce it. She just started walking. She walked into the transit artery at a normal pace. Steady. Not slow, not fast, the pace of someone who knows where they're going and isn't particularly impressed by whatever's in their way. She walked right through the middle of the Drenathi security formation. Not around it, through it. The Drenathi security officers shifted slightly as she moved through, the kind of subtle adjustment bodies make when something unexpected enters a space they've been projecting as controlled. She didn't look at any of them. She just walked. She walked to the other side of the formation, reached the far wall, turned and leaned against it. And then she stood there. Just stood there on the other side of the formation, in the space between the Drenathi and the entrance to the rest room, where the Sorvani delegation was taking their break. I don't know if she thought about it beforehand. I don't know if it was a conscious tactical decision, or just the instinct of someone who saw a thing that was wrong and put herself between the wrong thing and the people it was aimed at. I've wondered about that since. I asked her about it later. She said, and I'm paraphrasing her exact words because she used language I probably shouldn't reproduce verbatim on a platform that families watch. They were trying to scare somebody, so I went and stood where the somebody was going to have to walk. That's it, that's the whole explanation. She just went and stood where the vulnerable people were going to have to walk. The Drenathi security formation had not been designed for someone doing this. It was designed to be a passive presence, implicitly intimidating, explicitly deniable. A human woman walking through it without pausing and then stationing herself on the far side was not a scenario that the formation was equipped to deal with, because there was nothing to react to. She hadn't done anything, she was just standing there. The two younger humans, the researchers or surveyors, looked at each other for a moment. Then they both walked through the formation too. Same pace, steady, not performing anything, not making a show of it, just walking. They took up positions on either side of Jana, and then there were 3 humans standing in the space between the Drenathi security officers and the Sorvani delegation's rest room. I stood at the glass panel of the mediation suite door and watched this, and I am not ashamed to say that something happened in my chest that I couldn't quite name. Something old and complicated and proud. Here's the thing about that moment that I keep coming back to. The Drenathi security officers were armed. Jana Reyes had a personal sidearm, standard equipment for independent freight haulers operating in contested corridors, but it was holstered, and she never touched it. The researchers didn't appear to be armed at all. The Drenathi security formation outnumbered them 4-1. And yet the formation had stopped doing the thing it was doing. Because here's what the Drenathi tactic had relied on. The implicit threat of 12 armed beings in a corridor was meaningful only if the beings being implicitly threatened were alone. The tactic worked by isolation. You put the vulnerable party in a position where they had to walk through your implied power without support. The message was, you are alone here, we are not. 3 humans standing in that corridor had, without a single word or gesture of aggression, completely dissolved that dynamic. They were not alone anymore. The Sorvani delegation was not alone anymore. And the Drenathi security formation, which had been a statement, was now just 12 armed beings standing in a corridor looking at 3 humans who were also standing in a corridor. And there was nothing to do about it because everyone in that corridor, everyone in that transit artery, everyone who was watching, and a lot of people were watching now, could see exactly what had happened. I heard, through the mediation suite's ambient sound system, one of the Drenathi security officers say something to another. The station's interpretation system caught it and ran it through the universal translation. What are they doing? The other officer's reply, I don't know, which was the most honest thing anyone said in that corridor all day. I sent a comm to Marcus, I see it. He wrote back, should we do something? I thought about that for about 4 seconds. Then, they already did something. The recess ended at 16:30. Orvith Palin called everyone back into the mediation suite. The Sorvani delegation walked back to the suite. They walked through the transit artery intersection, through the now slightly less coherent Drenathi security formation, past the 3 humans who were standing there, and into the corridor. Vensereth, the Sorvani lead diplomat, paused as he passed Jana. He didn't say anything. He couldn't really, their communication modes weren't directly compatible without interpretation equipment, and he didn't have a unit on him. But he paused, and he looked at her, and Sorvani don't have eyebrows or human facial musculature, so I can't tell you what his expression meant in the way I describe a human expression. But the pause said something. The deliberate, conscious choice to stop for a moment and acknowledge her said something. She gave him a small nod. He continued into the corridor. The second half of the arbitration session was different. I don't know if Harvey knew what had happened in the corridor. I don't know if he'd been informed, or if he'd seen it himself, or if it was purely coincidence. But the aggressive reframing tactic he'd been running before the recess didn't come back. He returned to the specific dispute items. He was still adversarial, still pushing for Hexathane's position, still trying to find angles, but the particular flavor of implicit pressure that had defined the first half of the session was gone. The session ran another 2 hours. No resolution that day. Tier 2 arbitrations rarely resolved in one session. But Orvith Palin got the conversation back on track, and by the time she called the session closed, we had a framework for the next meeting that actually addressed the original dispute rather than Havin's preferred reframing. After the session, I gathered my documentation, powered down my recording equipment, and walked out into the corridor. Jana Rays was gone. The researchers were gone. The Dranathi security formation had dispersed. The transit artery was back to normal, the usual flow of commuters and traders and wanderers, nobody paying any particular attention to anything. Just a regular evening on Avelian's Rest. I went to the commissary and got actual coffee and sat down with Marcus and eventually Sarah Thulo, and we talked about the session for a while, and then we talked about other things, and it was a regular Thursday dinner. I thought that's probably the end of that. I was very wrong. 3 days later, a Dranathi warship entered the Pelhari Drift. Not near the arbitration zone, not near Avelian's Rest. It entered the drift at a point about 12 light hours from the corridor under dispute, and began what Hexathane's corporate communications office described as a routine security patrol to protect corporate assets and personnel. The Sorvani Collective filed an immediate protest with the Accord Council. Hexathane's response was that they had every right to conduct security operations in unclaimed space, that the drift corridor in question was not yet formally assigned to any party. That was the whole point of the arbitration, and that they were simply protecting their interests during the mediation period. The Accord Council deliberated. The Accord Council was, by design, very deliberate. Its deliberations took time. Time was something Hexathane was banking on. I got the report on my work terminal and read it twice, and then I went and found Sarah Thulo. Sarah Thulo was Velhari, which meant she was tall, angular, and had a crest of modified feathers along the ridge of her skull that shifted color with her emotional state. When she was calm, they were a deep blue-violet. When she was frustrated, they went through a kind of agitated amber. She was very frustrated when I found her. "You've read it," I said. 20 minutes ago, her crest was fully amber. They're not even hiding it. "No. This is the oldest play." She turned from her terminal. "You use the legal process to buy time while you establish facts on the ground. By the time the Accord Council issues any kind of formal response, the patrol ship has been there long enough to make its presence feel like a baseline. Then you argue that restricting Hexathane's access to the corridor would be a disruption of established operations. I knew this. I'd seen variations of it. But seeing it with an actual warship in an actual territory dispute felt different than reading about it in case archives. "What does the Sorvani Collective have in that region?" I asked. "Research vessels, no weapons. Their entire presence there is science ships and relay stations." She paused. "They are completely outmatched militarily. Hexathane knows that. That's why they're doing this." "What about Accord peacekeeping?" She gave me a look that was eloquent without being unkind. "Accord peacekeeping response time in the drift is 3 to 5 days in the best case. Hexathane will have whatever they need established by then." I sat down in the chair across from her desk. There was a window behind her, one of the station's external-facing viewports, and through it I could see the stars of the Pelhari Drift region, distant and very still. "I need to file a supplementary documentation report," I said, "on the session dynamics. The security formation in the corridor, what it was doing, what it was communicating, if it's in the official record." "It should be," she agreed. "But Corin, filing it correctly takes time too." I knew that. I filed it anyway. That evening, I found myself in the Commons. The Commons at night was a different thing than the Commons during the day. The overhead dome was dark now, or rather, the artificial lighting was dimmed enough that you could see through it, and what you saw was the drift, which was a region of the galaxy with unusually high stellar density. On a clear station night, the drift visible through the dome looked like someone had spilled salt across dark fabric. It was beautiful in a way that was almost aggressive about it, the kind of beautiful that you couldn't quite ignore even when you had a lot on your mind. I was sitting on one of the curved benches near the dome's center, coffee in hand, looking at it. Jana Rays sat down next to me. I hadn't spoken to her since before the corridor incident 3 days ago. I hadn't known how to approach it, honestly. What do you say to someone who did something that simple and that significant? I'd defaulted to saying nothing, which was cowardly, and I knew it. "You work for the Bureau," she said, statement not question. "ICMB? Yeah, I was at the session." "I know," she looked up at the dome. "I know what a Dranathi security formation in a corridor means. I've operated in their space before." I didn't say anything. "You know there's a warship in the drift now," she said. Yes. My freight routes go through the drift, 3 of them. She was quiet for a moment. My next run is in 8 days. I understood then that she hadn't just been standing up for the Sorvani delegation in that corridor. She had skin in this game, too. The Sorvani research corridor, the one Hexathane was trying to encroach on, if Hexathane established effective control over it, it changed the transit politics of the entire region. Independent haulers like Jana would face new registration requirements, new fees, potentially new restrictions. Corporate shipping interests always pushed for frameworks that favored corporate shipping. She had been standing up for the Sorvani, and she had also been standing up for herself. Both things were true at the same time. I put in a report about the corridor incident, I told her. It's in the official arbitration record now. She glanced at me. Does that help? Maybe eventually, I paused. I don't know. She nodded slowly. That's an honest answer. We sat in silence for a while, looking at the drift through the dome. What do you think's going to happen? She asked. I think the Accord Council is going to deliberate. I think Hexathane is going to use the deliberation period to consolidate their position. I think the Sorvani are going to be legally right and practically outmaneuvered. I stopped. That's not an official bureau assessment, I should say. Wasn't asking for an official bureau assessment. She finished whatever she was drinking, not coffee, something amber and slightly luminous that I didn't recognize. The galaxy has a lot of rules. It does. And a lot of ways to work around them without technically breaking them. Yes. She stood up. Doesn't sit right, she said. No, I agreed. It doesn't. She left. I stayed there a while longer, looking at the stars. The escalation happened on day 6. The Dranathi warship, designation Hexathane Security Vessel Cadrath 9, moved from its initial position in the drift to a location 1,200 kilometers from the nearest Sorvani research station. 1,200 kilometers in space sounds like a lot. In practical terms, for a vessel with combat capabilities, it was equivalent to parking a tank on someone's front lawn. The Sorvani research station was called Observation Post Velserath, named after a Sorvani scientist from 300 years ago, no relation to my colleague Sarathulo. It had a crew of 31 researchers. The research they were conducting was a long-term survey of stellar formation processes in the drift, the kind of science that takes decades and can't be moved without destroying years of accumulated data. Hexathane's official position was that Cadrath 9 was conducting navigational surveys of the corridor in question, and that its proximity to the Sorvani station was incidental. The Accord Council was deliberating. The deliberation was going to take, by the most optimistic estimates, another 4 to 5 days. I was in the communications office when the message came in from Observation Post Velserath. It was a formal distress communication, not a weapon fire emergency, not an attack, but the specific Accord-recognized signal for we are in a situation that threatens our operational integrity and we are requesting Accord intervention. The communications officer on duty, a Keth named Ovathrim, received it, logged it, and routed it to Orvith Palin's office with appropriate urgency flags. I stood in the doorway of the communications office and read the message on the display screen, and the thing I felt was not exactly fear and not exactly anger. It was something colder. The specific chill that comes from watching something unjust happen at a pace too slow to photograph, but fast enough that by the time you have the documentation, it's already done. I went to find Orvith Palin. Orvith Palin was Kasari, smaller than most species, with the bioluminescent patterns under her skin that Kasari used for emotional signaling the way humans used facial expressions. When she was thinking hard, the patterns around her temples went a deep, slow pulse of blue-green. When she was stressed, they went rapid and yellow. She was very rapidly yellow when I found her. "I've received it," she said before I could speak. "What are our options?" "Formally, I can escalate the distress communication to Priority 1 Accord review, which moves the Council timeline up. It will still take at least 2 days. Informally," she paused. The yellow slowed slightly. "Avelian's Rest has no vessels with any meaningful defensive capability. Our security complement is 46 officers equipped for station law enforcement. We are a mediation platform. We are not equipped to do anything about a warship 1,200 kilometers from a research station." The Sorvani Collective. has already communicated that they will not escalate militarily. Even if they had the capability, which is debatable, the Sorvani governing consensus is opposed to the use of force. It would require a consensus decision that they say cannot be reached in less than 2 weeks. I stood in her office and felt the slow shape of what was happening. The Drenathi warship, the deliberating council, the research station with 31 people in it, the Sorvani with no soldiers and no ships that could challenge what was sitting 1,200 kilometers from their people. Who else is near the drift right now? I asked. She looked at me steadily. I've already checked the regional vessel registry. And there are 11 registered vessels within response range of observation post Velserath. 7 of them are commercial freight ships, 3 are survey vessels, 1 is a passenger craft. The freight ships, I said. Who are they registered to? She was quiet for a moment. 4 are independent operators. Human. Another pause. 3 of the 4. I want to be careful here about how I describe what I'm going to describe next, because it would be very easy to make it sound dramatic or heroic or like something that was planned, and it wasn't any of those things. It was messier than that. It was more human than that. I went to find Jonna Reyes. She was in the station's freight bay, running maintenance on her ship, a mid-range hauler called the Corrigan Drift, which was a name I'd always liked for reasons I couldn't fully articulate. I found her under the cargo ramp, checking atmospheric seals. I told her what was happening. All of it, the warship position, the distress communication, the council timeline, Orvith Palin's vessel registry search. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she came out from under the ramp and looked at me. "You're asking me if I'll fly toward a Drenathi warship," she said. "I'm not asking you anything officially. I have no authority to ask you anything. I'm a logistics coordinator." "But you came and found me." "Yes." She thought about it, not for long. "The other independent operators, you said 2 more are human." "Yeah." "Do you know them?" "I know who they are. One of them has been through the station twice. Name's Osai Adolfo, runs a long haul between 6 systems, including 3 in the drift. The other one I only know by ship registration, vessel called the Callista Run." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "You know what a warship does when commercial freight vessels move into a contested zone?" "Nothing," I said. "Technically, under Accord regulations, commercial freight vessels in unclaimed space have free transit rights. A warship can log their presence. Can't intercept, can't threaten, can't do anything that would constitute an Accord violation. Unless they want to start an incident that makes the arbitration look even worse for them." "Right." She looked at the stars through the freight bay's open outer door. The drift was visible from here too, closer than from the Commons dome, more vivid, less filtered. "How many researchers on that station?" she asked. 31. She nodded once. "Let me make some calls." I went back to my work and tried to do my job and mostly failed. It took Jonna about 2 hours to reach the other independent operators. I don't know exactly what she said to them. I wasn't on those calls. I know she called Osai Adolfo first. She knew him from previous routes in the region. I know the person registered to the Callista Run turned out to be a woman named Priya Selvam, who'd been hauling cargo through the drift for 11 years, and who, when she heard what was happening, said something that Jonna later described to me as extremely decisive and not suitable for broadcast. 2 hours after I'd found Jonna in the freight bay, she calmed me. 3 ships were going. I closed my eyes for a second. Then I need to inform Orvith Palin. Obviously, a pause. "Corin, we're cargo haulers entering unclaimed space on our normal routes. We're not doing anything. We're just going to be there." "I know. Make sure it's in your documentation." "It will be." Orvith Palin, when I told her, went through approximately 4 different emotional states in rapid succession, as registered by her bioluminescent patterns. The final state she settled into was a long, slow blue-green pulse that I'd learned to read as something like resigned acceptance mixed with deep thought. "I cannot officially endorse this," she said. "I know. I cannot unofficially endorse this either, because I am the chief mediator of this station, and anything I say constitutes a quasi-official position." "I know." I am going to go review the Accord's commercial transit provisions in detail, she said, and I am going to be very busy doing that for the next several hours and will not be monitoring the regional vessel registry during that period. That makes sense, I said. Administrative review is important. It is, she agreed. The provisions are very complex. She turned back to her terminal. I left her office. 3 hours after that conversation, the Corrigan Drift, Osai Adolfo's vessel, the Kumasi Bridge, and the Callista Run departed Avelian's rest on logged commercial routes that took them through the Pelhari Drift corridor. This was not unusual. Commercial traffic through the drift happened constantly. 3 independent haulers transiting the corridor was a completely routine day. The Cadrath 9 tracked them on its sensors the moment they entered the drift. Of course it did. A Drenathi warship with full sensor arrays was going to track every vessel in range. The Kumasi Bridge was the first to establish a position near observation post Velserath. Not close, 5 kilometers from the station's outer perimeter, which was far enough to be clearly outside the station's operational space, but close enough that they were unambiguously present. The Corrigan Drift took up a position on the station's opposite side. The Callista Run parked between the station and the direction of the Cadrath 9. 3 cargo haulers, no weapons beyond personal sidearms, combined crew of maybe 12 people. No military training, no tactical formation experience, no authority whatsoever to do anything except float in unclaimed space on commercial transit routes. The Cadrath 9 was 1,200 kilometers away. It didn't move. I was watching the regional sensor display in the communications office when this was happening. Ovathrim, the Keth communications officer, was pretending very hard to be doing something else while also watching the same display. The sensor map showed the 3 commercial hauler signatures clustered near the small dot of observation post Velserath. It showed the much larger signature of the Cadrath 9 at its position. For about 40 minutes, nothing changed. Then one of the Sorvani researchers from Velserath sent a message to the station. It was addressed to the General Communications Office rather than to any specific party. The message, and I have the exact translation because I pulled the archive, said, "We see the small ships. We know what they are. We know why they have come. We don't have a word in our language for what we are feeling right now, but it is the kind of feeling that makes us want to tell you that we see them. That is all. We see them." Ovathrim read it on the display. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said in his native Keth that the station's system translated for me, "That is a very significant message." "Yeah," I said. "In Keth culture," he said, "when someone places themselves between harm and another person, the person who is protected is required to formally acknowledge the action. It is a debt that must be spoken. The acknowledgement is more important than the protection itself, because the protection is physical but the acknowledgement is spiritual." He looked at the display with the 3 little cargo ship signatures. "I believe the Sorvani just performed their equivalent of that acknowledgement," he said. The Cadrath 9 sent a formal communication to Avelian's rest 6 hours after the 3 commercial ships arrived. The communication was addressed to Chief Mediator Orvith Palin. It stated that Hexathane Industries wished to flag the presence of unauthorized vessels near the disputed corridor zone and requested that the station issue a formal directive to the vessels to maintain clear distance from the ongoing navigational survey operations. Orvith Palin's response was a masterpiece of bureaucratic precision that I saved a copy of and have reread several times since, just for the pleasure of it. In roughly 2,000 words of Accord administrative language, she explained that 1. The vessels in question were commercial freight operators with valid transit registrations. 2. The space they were occupying was, as Hexathane itself had argued in the arbitration proceedings, unclaimed and subject to free transit. 3. There was therefore no regulatory basis for any directive restricting their operations. 4. She noted, with the specific formal phrase that signals a legal flag in Accord documentation, that the Cadrath 9's request appeared to contradict Hexathane's own stated position regarding the unclaimed nature of the corridor, and that this contradiction had been noted in the arbitration record. In other words, you cannot argue the space is unclaimed so you can be there, and then argue it's restricted so the cargo ships can't be there. Pick one. The Kadreth 9 did not respond. 12 hours later, it withdrew from its position near Velserath and moved back to its original location in the drift, far from the research station, far from the corridor zone, far from the 3 commercial ships that were still sitting there, engines on standby, crew probably drinking coffee and watching whatever entertainment they had downloaded. The Accord Council's formal ruling came 3 days after that. The ruling was straightforward. The corridor in question was to be designated a protected research zone for an initial period of 15 years, during which Hexathane would have scheduled transit rights but no operational rights. The Sorvani research program at Observation Post Velserath would continue under explicit Accord protection. It was a complete win for the Sorvani position, cleaner than anyone had expected. I asked Orvith Palin afterward whether she thought the commercial ship's presence had affected the outcome. She considered this carefully. The Accord Council's ruling is based on legal analysis of the applicable treaty provisions, she said. Yes, and on the documentary record of the arbitration proceedings. Yes, both the substantive record and the supplementary documentation. She paused, which comprehensively recorded the nature of the Dranathi security presence during the session, the nature of the warship's positioning, and the sequence of events leading to Hexathane's contradictory legal position regarding the corridor's status. Right. I believe the documentary record was very thorough, she said. I tried to be complete. Yes, another pause. The Council was also, I understand, aware of the regional vessel movements during the critical period. Because the sensor logs are part of the Accord's standard operational record. So the 3 commercial ships are a matter of Accord record, yes. Her bioluminescent patterns were doing something I hadn't seen before, a slow, warm amber that was different from the stressed yellow I associated with frustration. It is difficult to maintain a legal position that contested space is both unclaimed and exclusively yours, she said, when 3 cargo ships are floating in it, and you cannot challenge them without making the contradiction explicit. You might be wondering where the 11 minutes and 42 seconds of footage comes in. So far I've told you about a corridor incident, 3 cargo ships, and an arbitration that resolved more favorably than expected. None of that is the footage that's been watched 300 million times on the Sorvani homeworld. The footage is from after. 2 weeks after the Accord Council ruling, a formal diplomatic reception was held on Avelian's Rest. This was standard procedure following a major arbitration resolution, a way of officially closing the process and allowing the parties to reset their relationship, theoretically. These receptions were usually stiff and formal, and everyone stood around eating food from 7 different planets and pretending they didn't all dislike each other. This one was different because of who came. The Sorvani sent an expanded delegation, not just the 3 arbitration representatives but 7 additional beings, including a member of their collective's governing consensus who had traveled specifically for the occasion. The Dranathi sent Having and a reduced security detail. Various other parties with interests in the drift, several species I've mentioned, and some I haven't, sent observers. The reception was in the Commons, the big space with the dome. Jana was there because I'd invited her. Osai and Priya were there because Jana had calmed them and told them to come. They were still at the station. Post-arbitration, there were some freight documentation items that needed processing. And honestly, I think all 3 of them had been waiting to see how things resolved before deciding their next route. They were not dressed formally. Jana was in the same kind of practical clothes she always wore. Osai was a large, quiet Ghanaian man who'd been hauling cargo through the drift for 23 years and who dressed like he always dressed, which was comfortably. Priya had made a slight concession to the occasion by wearing a jacket over her standard flight suit, which felt honestly like the right amount of ceremony for what they'd done. Yethoru was there, the Kasari diplomatic observer. He had a recording device. Kasari observers always do. Documentation is a professional requirement for their role, and he'd had it running as background operational footage since the reception started. Which is why the next 11 minutes and 42 seconds exist as a recording. The Sorvani governing consensus member approached Jana Reyes about 30 minutes into the reception. I was standing nearby, close enough to see but not part of the conversation. I had a glass of something that the caterers had identified as compatible with human biochemistry. which I'd taken to mean, won't kill you rather than tastes good. The Sorvani governing member's name was, and I'm going to give you the translated version because the original is 11 syllables, and I always mangle it, something like, first listener of the seventh accord moment. In Sorvani culture, the governing consensus is expressed through specific members who are given names that describe their function rather than their identity. First listener was essentially the head of the consensus delegation, an extremely significant being by Sorvani standards. First listener stopped in front of Jana. Jana looked at them with the particular quality she had of looking directly at things without making it confrontational. First listener did not speak. The Sorvani governing member produced something from a carrier, a small object that I later learned was a resonant stone, a specific Sorvani artifact that was, I was told, the closest thing their culture had to a physical expression of formal gratitude. The kind of thing given in specific circumstances that the Sorvani considered among the most significant of social interactions. The stone was placed in Jana's hands, and then first listener did something that nobody in that room expected. They bowed. Full, complete, sustained, the Sorvani gesture of profound acknowledgement that is reserved in their culture for occasions of genuine existential significance. Not ceremony, not diplomacy, the real thing. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people pretending not to notice something. The actual quiet of people who have stopped doing whatever they were doing because something just happened that they need to pay attention to. Jana held the resonant stone in both hands and looked at first listener, and I could see from where I was standing that she had not expected this and did not know exactly what to do with it. She was a cargo hauler. She moved freight. She had stood in a corridor because something was wrong and she'd fixed it the only way she knew how. She was not prepared for a head of a Sorvani governing consensus to bow to her. She did what made sense to her. She nodded carefully the way she'd nodded to Ven Sarath in the corridor 3 weeks earlier. A small, real acknowledgement. First listener rose. And then, this is the part of the footage that everyone has seen, first listener spoke. Through the reception's translation system, the words resolved into every language present simultaneously. We were afraid, we had no soldiers, we had no weapons, we did not know what would happen. And then there were 3 ships. 3 small ships with no weapons, and they came because it was wrong that we were alone. That is all. It was wrong, and they made it right. The only way that thing could be made right by being there. By being present. A pause, the room very still. We have studied humanity for many years. We have been uncertain about humanity. We have had reasons to be uncertain, but we have been looking at the wrong things. Another pause. We were looking at what humans do when they are fighting. We should have been looking at what humans do when someone else cannot fight. Yethoru's recording captures the rest of the room in that moment. It captures the Velhari delegates with their crests going through colors I don't have names for. It captures the Dranathi delegation, having among them, standing very still in a way that reads, across species, as something like discomfort. It captures the Keth station staff, who had drifted to the edges of the room over the course of the reception, and who were now standing there with that particular Keth quality of absolute stillness that their species adopts when something resonates with them deeply. It captures Osai Adolfo, who is standing to Jana's left, looking at the floor with an expression that I can only describe as a man who is feeling something large and doesn't have anywhere convenient to put it. It captures Priya Selvam, who is very visibly not crying, in the specific way that someone is very visibly not crying when they absolutely are. It captures me. I look tired in the recording. My hair needs cutting. I'm holding a glass of something that probably doesn't taste good, and I'm looking at first listener with an expression that I've analyzed since and still can't fully categorize. And it captures Jana Reyes, who is looking at the resonant stone in her hands, who then looks up at first listener, and who says in her flat, practical cargo hauler voice, the thing that became the thing everyone quoted afterward. 31 people by themselves in a lot of empty space. What was I supposed to do? Go the other way? The recording circulated. Yethoru submitted it to the Kasari Diplomatic Archive, which was standard practice. The Kasari Archive was nominally a closed system for official use, but Kasari Diplomatic Archives had more cross-species access agreements than almost any other institutional database in the galaxy, because the Kasari had been operating as neutral observers and mediators for centuries, and everyone trusted their records. Within 48 hours of submission, the footage had been accessed by observers from 11 different species. Within a week, it was circulating through informal networks. Within a month, it had been viewed more times than the Accord Council's ruling that had accompanied it. I know why. It's not the bow, it's not first listener's speech, though that speech has been translated into 63 languages and taught in Sorvani schools. It's Jana's line. That final line. What was I supposed to do? Go the other way? Because that line encodes something that the galaxy had been trying to understand about humanity for decades and getting wrong. The galaxy had been looking at human warfare and human aggression and human military history, and trying to understand us from that angle, and what the footage showed was that the aggression and the protectiveness come from the same place. They're not opposites. They're expressions of the same fundamental quality. Humans don't stop doing the right thing because the odds are bad. That's what the galaxy kept missing. They'd watched us fight against enemies who outmatched us and concluded, humans are violent. They didn't realize they were watching the same people who would stand in a corridor facing 12 armed security officers, because someone was going to have to walk through that corridor, and it was wrong for them to be alone. It's not violence, it's not aggression, it's a specific refusal to accept the way the situation has been arranged. 3 people in a corridor? No, we're standing here. 3 ships in unclaimed space? No, 31 people are not going to be alone out there. And the line, what was I supposed to do? Go the other way. As though going the other way was not a real option. As though the option didn't parse. As though the question itself revealed a fundamental confusion about what kind of person you were dealing with. The Human Military Restriction Clause came up for its 7-year review 6 months after the incident. It had been reviewed twice before, both times renewed without significant debate. This review was different. I wasn't in the room for the Accord Council deliberations. Nobody outside the Council is. But I know what the public submissions said, because public submissions to Accord Council reviews are part of the record, and I read all of them that pertain to the clause. The Sorvani Collective submitted a formal position statement. It ran to about 400 pages in translated form. The core argument, summarized, was this. The restriction clause was premised on the assumption that human military capability represented a threat to galactic stability. The assumption was reasonable given the historical record. However, it was worth examining what the clause had not considered, namely, whether the galaxy might, under certain circumstances, need human capacity not for warfare, but for the specific quality of protective presence that humans seem to demonstrate in ways that other species did not. The Sorvani did not argue for removing the clause. They argued for a fundamental reconsideration of its premises. The Velhari delegation submitted a separate statement. It referenced the Avelian's Rest footage directly. It made an argument that I found surprisingly moving in its directness, that the Accord had been attempting to manage human danger, and had not considered that the same qualities that made humans dangerous made them, in different circumstances, uniquely valuable. That the galaxy's attempt to contain humanity might have been containing the wrong thing. Even the Drenathi, not Hexathane specifically, but the broader Drenathi Accord delegation, submitted a position acknowledging that the Avelian's Rest situation had not unfolded as Hexathane had anticipated, and that this might be relevant data regarding human behavior patterns. The Council deliberated. The clause was not removed, it was modified. The modification created a new category, Human Protective Deployment Authorization. Under specific conditions, when a non-military human presence in a contested zone would serve a protective function without constituting offensive military action, human vessels and personnel could operate beyond the 300 light-year radius, subject to Accord oversight and Council approval. It was not a full reversal, but it was a crack in the wall. And it had been opened, essentially, by 3 cargo haulers who went and stood where they were supposed to stand. I stayed on Avelian's Rest for 3 more months before my posting rotated. Before I left, I had a final dinner with Marcus and Sarathulo that ran about 3 hours longer than our usual Thursday dinners, and ended with all 3 of us standing at a viewport watching the drift and not saying much. Sarathulo's crest was the calm, deep blue violet of a person who has processed something fully. Marcus was quieter than usual, which for Marcus was saying something. "Do you think it changes things?" Marcus asked eventually. "Fundamentally." Sarathula was quiet for a moment. "In Velhari culture," she said, "we have an expression. I'll translate it as best I can. It means something like the truth that was always there being seen for the first time. Not a new truth, an old one that finally became visible." "And this is that?" Marcus asked. "I think so. The galaxy knew what humans were, saw the history, drew conclusions, and those conclusions weren't wrong exactly. They were just—" She paused, arranging the thought. "They were answering the wrong question. They were asking, what do humans do? And the answer to that question is complicated and sometimes frightening. But the better question is, why do humans do things? And the answer to that question is something the galaxy hadn't fully seen before." She looked at the drift. "The why is, because someone has to. Because it's wrong if no one does. Because 31 people are alone in a lot of empty space, and what are you supposed to do? Go the other way." I flew home to Earth 2 months later. First time in 3 years. I went to see my parents, who live outside Glasgow, in a house on the edge of a valley that my father has spent 20 years convincing to grow things it was not designed to grow. I sat on their back porch for an entire afternoon doing nothing except looking at the valley. And I thought about the drift through the Common's dome, and about the resonant stone in Jana's hands, and about Ven Sarath pausing in a corridor to acknowledge a person he couldn't speak to. My mother asked me if anything interesting had happened on the posting. I said yes, a few things. She waited for details, and I thought about how to begin, and eventually I said, "There was a situation, a pretty bad situation, and it got better because 3 people went and stood somewhere they didn't have to stand." She looked at me. "That's it. That's most of it." She thought about this. My mother has never left Earth. She has strong opinions about her garden, about several television programs, and about how the Global Federation has been mismanaging equatorial water rights. She is a very practical person. "Well," she said, "if you see the bad thing happening and you can go stand between it and the person it's happening to, what else would you do?" I looked at her. She went back to her tea. And sitting there in that valley outside Glasgow, I thought about Jana Rays in that corridor on Avelian's Rest, and First Listener bowing, and the Sorvani message. We see the small ships. We know why they have come. And about 11 minutes and 42 seconds of shaky footage watched 300 million times by a species that doesn't have soldiers. And I thought, we've been explaining ourselves wrong for 100 years. We kept leading with the history, with the wars, with the weapons programs and the territorial conflicts, and all the complicated, terrible, real things that humanity did when we were afraid and expanding, and convinced that the only way to be safe was to make everyone else less safe. We should have been leading with this, with the question that apparently confuses the entire galaxy. What was I supposed to do? Go the other way? The galaxy banned us from war because they were scared of what we do. And now they're starting to understand the other side of that fear. The side that looks at 12 armed beings in a corridor and thinks, so what? The side that looks at a warship 1,200 kilometers from 31 researchers and says, not today. The side that doesn't experience the odds as relevant information. The human military restriction clause still exists. We're still working through the implications of the modification. The galaxy is still, in many ways, figuring out what to do with us. But the recording is out there, all 11 minutes and 42 seconds of it. And the last 7 of those seconds, just Jana's face, looking down at a stone she's holding, then up at the being who gave it to her. And then the line. The last 7 seconds are the ones that play in Sorvani schools and in Velhari military academies, and apparently even in some Drenathi institutions, though they don't publicize that. The ones that play on loop, because the whole galaxy is still trying to understand. What was I supposed to do? Go the other way? Like going the other way was never a real option. Like the question itself doesn't make sense. Like the only thing to do, when you see the wrong thing happening, is to walk toward it.